how that interrogation went, and then how that interrogation was portrayed when we eventually got to the trial process.
Right. And I think that I go into great detail in the book about that part because it's important. It's how many kids are lost. In Illinois, there was a lot of movement by a bunch of different amazing groups to get a law passed that you can't lie to juveniles, right? And so let me explain to you how my experience was. So again, we go to this party. There's this argument between these two roommates. We leave the party, and 30 days later, there's a card in my door, and the card says robbery, homicide. So I called this card on the door. This was in the summertime. I was headed to junior college, where I went almost 10 years later after my release. So I call this number, and they're telling me that I have nothing to worry about. Just come on down. I'm 17 in the state of Illinois. You're considered an adult. You said you were going to college. You don't have anything to worry about. I was told that my name, they needed me to come down to take a picture so they can clear my name out of a robbery, is what I was told. When I went down to the police station, it wasn't about a robbery at all. And I thought again that if I simply just told them the truth, that I would be okay. But the funny thing is, they knew the truth from the time that they first started to investigate this case, because what led to our exoneration was a statement from another student that completely undermined the false allegations and narrative that was put together by the police. And they withheld it, and we never knew. So the questions that they were asking were to try to diminish the statement that was of our innocence, and we didn't even know it existed.
Yeah, I apologize for this, but I'm gonna put in a little shameless plug. This experience of being at the police station and being misled, or there being intentional kind of strategy by your interrogators to get the things out of you that will support a conviction is not unusual. In fact, it's the common practice. So that's one of the reasons why the Cook County Public Defender's Office has established a service that would allow for individuals to call a public defender if you're arrested and you're at the police station, because no matter what happened or what happens, it is in a person's best interest to have counsel, while they're, before they're being interrogated. Absolutely. So 844-81-RIGHT, RIGHT, the Public Defender's Office will come to any police station in Cook County. And, if who knows what could happen if, a person who's being taken advantage of doesn't give statements that then will be used against them. And your story is a perfect example of how they kind of twisted what you said and preyed upon your youth, and also preyed upon what our mothers teach us. Just tell the truth and it'll be okay, right? Yeah. A perfect example, right?
It's a dangerous thing because, look, that's not a shameless plug at all. And I hope that someone could put that number in the chat, because I'm telling you right now, in 1998, when this happened to me, I could repeat every lyric to Tupac's double CD, but I did not know one amendment to our Constitution, which would have provided me with the knowledge to know I'm afforded the right to counsel, even as a kid, even when I believe I did nothing wrong. It wasn't germane to me to back then to understand the laws that were afforded to me. And I think that that's the cocoon in which these communities are in, and a lot of people just don't get. It is very easy for people to watch from their comfortable couches and see people of color from these communities paraded across the TV in handcuffs and just assume that whatever it is that they're accused of, they did. And those are the type of jury pools that we get as well. And that's exactly the atmosphere that I was in the state of Wisconsin, which is the state that locks up more Black males per capita than any other state in the country.
Let's talk about that trial process. There were numerous parts of this book that brought me to tears. And there were numerous parts of this book that kind of triggered me as both a young Black man growing up in the city, but also as a young Black attorney trying to explain to other young Black men how this system works. And one of those pieces was this idea, you saw that jury, right? And, sometimes we hear jury of our peers, right? And tell me about the construction of the jury that you faced.
So I took time to explain the voir dire process, which is the jury process. And I did it without the legalities. I did it from the perspective of as I was as a kid. I remember asking questions and not even knowing what voir dire was when I was in the courtroom. And the lawyer explained to me, oh, that's the jury. We get to pick the juries. And I'm like, okay, well, that's good. We could pick the juries. He didn't break down to me that any person of color could be struck off of a jury just because, right? And I don't believe we had a Black person in the jurors or the alternates. And we had some, I believe it was a Native and an Asian, they were struck immediately. So that's when I started to ask questions, and I asked my attorney, I said, why were they struck? How were they struck? How is this a jury of my peers? So he tried to explain to me, but the one thing that just stuck to me that I didn't get was, he tried to explain to me how a jury of my peers, an all-white jury, as long as they had one white woman, it was considered a jury of my peers, and I struggled with that. I said, I need you to break that down to me. He says, well, women are considered a minority. So because of that, all-white jury, you have a minority, that's a juror of your peers. Now, if that's not a loophole in our Constitution, in our criminal justice system, I don't know what to call it, but it's very clear that it's a problem.
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge problem even today here in Cook County, a population, that is diverse, where our jury pools and our juries oftentimes don't reflect what we see when it comes to accused people. But I want to take a step back. I'm thinking chronologically as I read the book, and I want to talk a little bit about the incarceration. And I don't want to trigger some things that you've gone through that I know is probably really difficult for you. But one of the things that almost had me crying on the train, right, as I was kind of reading this book, right, was that initial description of your incarceration at Cook County Jail. The things that you went through as a 17-year-old kid, not that even if you had experience being arrested, that you should be used to, but the idea that you had not been through that process. And talk about just the really things that us in the system would see as like an everyday thing, the thing that happens to thousands and thousands of people. But talk about kind of that initial, if it's okay with you, the things that you went through as you were first incarcerated in Cook County Jail.
And I appreciate you asking that, but Sharone, look, when I wrote this book, I completely numb myself, to the pains, because I figured if I pained a little to save a lot, it was well worth it. We're looking at carnage on the south side and west side of Chicago right now. And there are nothing but kids who look like me and you. So in speaking about this chapter about the Cook County Jail, it was one of the most horrific experiences that I ever had. And in fact, it's not Cook County Jail. It should be called Cook County Mental Hospital, because that's what's there. There are a number of individuals that should not be housed in the Cook County Jail. They should be somewhere getting treatment for mental disabilities and mental health issues. I saw a number of different things that I didn't put in the book, but the one thing that I did put in the book is how it doesn't matter how innocent you are. When you get there, everybody is treated the same, and that same treatment is inhumane. This was back when they used to make every man line up against the wall and strip naked in a long hallway. Everyone would be made to bend, cough over right next to each other. And I remember that this one guy, he was either coming down off a high or in withdrawals, but he wasn't moving fast enough. And one of the sheriffs threw a boot and it whizzed past my head and hit him right in the head. And I saw a number of different things like that. I saw people who were in desperate need of medication, looking as if they're taking the medication and then throwing it in a toilet. And here they are acting out now amongst everybody else because they're not properly treated. There was the bullpen situation, where the capacity of the bullpen is only supposed to hold 20 people, 25. It's 30 people in here, 40 people in here, and everybody's in here, and you're being called and being shuffled to the front to talk to a public defender amongst 30 or 40 people. And I remember again, at the time, I remember the public defender asking me questions and becoming frustrated because I didn't know the answers to them, because I looked like I should know the process of going to jail. And that was my experience with Cook County Mental Hospital.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that, you know, advocates have spent a lot of time working on, whether we're talking about the jail system or whether we're talking about the prison system, state prison system, is this idea that it is a mental health facility, and that being really a real fiction, right? Yeah. Because if you are dealing with a population of folks, and it doesn't matter if you're a special population, everybody needs healthcare, right? Indeed. Everybody needs care. And the idea that you can receive that care in these facilities, it's false. And we see that over and over and over again. If we think about these jails and prisons as mental health facilities, we know that there's a need, but if we think about them as mental health facilities, we won't get the things that we're trying to get to. People aren't going to get the treatment that they need. So I love that you talked about that piece in your book, pointing that out. Let's move on. You were transferred. You spend time in prison, which is obviously different than jail, but you kind of built yourself up, right? Yeah. You were able to kind of work on your case, obviously, but work on the cases of other folks. Tell me a little bit about the impact that access to law libraries had on your growth, your mindset, and eventually the outcomes that you received.
Yeah, well, perfect example of what it's like, and how steep a hill you gotta climb in terms of getting any type of reasonable resources to try to argue for innocence. You could buy I was in such a rush to get out of Cook County Jail. I said, man, I can't wait to get out of here and get up there, as if there was going to be something better for me. It wasn't. You could buy, to answer your question specifically, you could buy 25 bags of chips a week, but you could only get 10 stamps. You get that? So it's stuff like that, right? So you could sit up there and eat chips and just lay up in your cell and watch TV, but don't you try to mail out more than 10 letters and try to get some help and try to get some legal advice or something like that. No, that's frowned upon. So that was one of the first eye-opening things that I experienced. And then, so there are two things that I talk about in the book that are important in my life tale. Number one, I'm an 80s baby, right? And I got a chance to see before the crack epidemic hit. At that time is where all of the drug laws and all the tough on crime and all that type of stuff was being instituted. Then as I'm incarcerated in the late 90s is where I am in the midst of the prison boom. So from late 90s to early 2000s, our prisons went to the millions, right? Mm-hmm. And so when I got there, I remember before I got the crazy nickname, the little Johnny Cochran MFer down on the first tier, they were calling me Youngin. And they were calling me Youngin because I was just 19. And I was one of the youngest, people who was in this institution because I had 28 years in prison. I was in a maximum/super maximum prison. So I was one of the youngest that was there. And I started to do things to just get me out of the way of trouble. So I became a tutor. And I went to the law library, and I remember having a visit with my mom, that just left me in tears. And I decided that I was going to fight vigorously to try to prove my innocence, or just prove to her, that she's not wasting her time in supporting me. And so as I started to come up with this plan, I realized that being a tutor will put me in a law library. And that's where I was humbled, Sharone. I thought that I was the only one, that was wrong. I thought that, I was the only one, happen chance, no attorney, in a situation. I wasn't. I met a number of men who I had become friends with, who pled guilty, not because they was, but because they needed to get out, because they didn't want to lose their job at UPS, because that's all they had to feed their kids. I met a number of men who pled guilty and couldn't tell you one element of the charge that they pled guilty to, because they took the advice of someone or of a counsel to just get it over with. I met a number of men who could read, but literally could not have any understanding of what it was that they were reading. And that humbled me, because I thought, here it was, Jarrett Adams, raised right, not in trouble. I thought I was better than them. Yeah, I didn't have a tattoo teardrop under my eye. No, I didn't have a police raid in my house and selling drugs. I was humbled because I realized that they were me. Yeah. A number of people there, innocent. Some people may have been guilty, but were they guilty enough to be given 20 and 30-year sentences and pleading guilty to things like that they had no idea about? It humbled me and it frightened me to death, because by the time I got ready to get out of prison, they weren't calling me youngin' anymore, because the population of the prison wasn't mainly older people. Now it was filled predominantly with people who were just like me when I came in prison 8 years before. 18, 19, and 20-year-olds made up the prison, and they were comfortable there. And that scared me to death.
It's really hard sometimes for folks who work in the criminal legal system, right? Folks who see these things that happen every day, and it's just normal. But what they are tiny atrocities. And we have so many tiny atrocities built into the DNA and the fabric of the legal system. From the idea that we don't fund public defense, indeed, so you have the caseloads that you have, to we have systems that encourage is actually too weak of a word, incentivize. Actually, don't think it's incentivize. I think it's force people into guilty pleas. Indeed. This idea that it's completely legal to say, hey, I'll give you 3 years incarceration, but if you execute your rights and you go to trial and you lose, and remember, that's that jury of your so-called peers, of the people that are deciding. Yeah. You'll get triple or quadruple the time. Yeah. Right? Or the idea that we basically run the legal system as if we're renting the courthouse by the hour. Yeah. And it's all about speed and efficiency. There are so many things. Jury taxes, the way we fund public defense, who makes the decisions about who's guilty and who's not guilty. Exactly. So many structures go into that result that you identified, where you have just an incredible amount of men who are incarcerated that are not there because a jury decided they were guilty based upon a fair review of the facts. Yeah. But because the system is built to get people to plead as fast as possible.
That is spot on. Yeah, so I mean, and I'm glad that you said it, and you said it with such conviction. And who should be surprised when you're seeing it every day, right? Yep. You're seeing it. And it's just heartbreaking, because what it does is it puts a person's life on layaway. So they're in and out, and then they're mad that they ever pled guilty from the very beginning just to get it over with. Now their life is essentially over with. Yep.
I want to pull back something that you said. You mentioned your family. And, in reform conversations, before I was a public defender, and I still work on reform stuff, but as I was working on reform, one of the things that I always tried to help educate decision makers and legislators on was this idea that when we incarcerate somebody, right, we're not just incarcerating that person that we're accusing or we believe did a bad thing. We're
Yeah,
also incarcerating a whole community
indeed.
of supporters, right, of that person, right? So
Yeah,
tell me a little bit. And again, I feel terrible asking these questions. I know this is
yeah,
incredibly traumatic to you and your
yeah.
family, but if you're okay with it, please
Right.
tell me about how not only you had to live through this, but the
Yeah,
people around you.
yeah. I mean, I it didn't become as real to me until, in terms of what was lost holistically. To me, I knew I was in there. I knew I had lost almost a decade, but I didn't realize how much else I had lost until I came home. So I came home in February of 2007. And I'll never forget this year because it was the only year that I saw the Bears in the Super Bowl my entire life. In 1985, I was a kid. I don't remember the Super Bowl shuffle. Okay. So I remember this year, and I remember getting together, the family get together. I'm sure a lot of people do this as well. When you get together with family get togethers, one of the things that might pop out is the family photo album, right? I remember going through this photo album, and I remember looking at my life, the evolution of me as a kid, looking at, you know, nieces, nephews, and pictures of other folks. They continue on. My picture stopped when I was 17 years old, and I didn't have another picture in the album at all. And that was the small thing. Then there was, this is a Black family, South Side, no different than the West Side, no different than any others in the city. We were cookouts, fish fries, get-togethers, and then I come home and now I'm visiting folks in dialysis treatment, senior citizen homes. So when I got out, part of the reason why I went on this breakneck pace to get to where I was is because I was afraid that they would die before they got a chance to see who it was that they raised and supported. And that's exactly what ended up happening. I lost my godfather and my godmother, Sugar, Josephine in the book. She told me she was proud of me when I graduated law school, but then in the next breath, she asked me who I was again because she didn't remember me because she was battling with dementia. And I think that that's the stuff that people don't get when we talk about crime and we talk about justice. What is just? Who are the true victims? Because I'm willing to argue this. The real victims are the communities in which the people predominantly make up the prison systems come out of. The South Side and the West Side. They are feeding the prison its babies. And in turn, the IDOC is feeding these communities of color. People who are ill-equipped to reintegrate back into society and have been stripped of any meaningful way to provide for themselves, but then told to go sit still and just do the best you can.
We're going to talk about reentry in a second, but I want to just kind of talk a little bit about that point about victims. There are community we live in. We know that there are victims of gun violence. There are victims of sexual assault. There are victims of battery. Those voices should never be erased, and we should never deny that those victims exist.
Absolutely.
But you've just really highlighted this idea that we should really be thinking about a more expansive definition of victim, right? There are more than one victim. There's a person who is a crime survivor, and their experiences should never be forgotten. And we should always be working toward a world in which folks don't have to face that, but they're also victims, right, who see their young people go away, right? and not come back for decades and decades and decades? And how does that affect the children of those who are incarcerated? How does it affect the mothers and fathers of those that are incarcerated, their aunties and uncles? The idea that victim means one thing is one of the biggest misconceptions we have of the legal system. And I'm praying for a day when we can have that more broader conversation. And we're starting to have it, of what a victim is and how do we prevent victimhood. So thank you so much for expanding that and put a fine point of that. I want to talk a little bit about reentry. You know, although you were wrongfully convicted, you shared the struggles that literally tens of thousands of people in this county, you know, much larger numbers when we're talking about the state or the country, deal with when it comes to release from incarceration. You know, 95, 97, I've heard different numbers. 97% of people, or 95% or 92% of people are going to come back home from incarceration. You know, tell me about the difficulties that you had coming back home and trying to make a life for yourself and your family.
Yeah, and I definitely want to make sure that and I'm glad you pointed this out as well. Reentry, period, is a problem. Whether wrongfully convicted or not, it's a problem. And that 92% number is accurate, if not a little bit higher. People who are incarcerated in our criminal system, 92% of them are coming home. There's only a small percentage of people who have natural life and who are on the death penalty. And so for me, I don't like Sharone, listen, man, it would be easy for me to sit up here and stick my chest out like a 10-foot peacock and tell you I did this all on my own. You know, look at me. Man, I have my mother, I have my two aunts, and like they were built differently, you know, and I talk about this in my book. You know, my mother and my aunts, they came from the cotton fields of Mississippi when, you know, slavery was supposed to be over, but the only jobs were still in the cotton fields. And my grandfather did his best to get each one of his kids out of that area as best he could. And so my grandmother would repeat things to us, the grandkids that is, and say, look, you know, two people better not show up at my door. I better not have the school or the police show up at my door. And you know why? Because I brought your mama and your aunties and your this and that, and it was instilled in us. So as a result, when I came home, I had a solid family foundation. And that is really vital to how I was able to have the time to heal, right? Because you can't go until, you know, you got the gas, you got the wheels, you got everything. When I came home, I was a shell. I didn't have wheels and all of that. And my mom and my aunts, the thing about the Black community and a lot of communities is mental health and the effects is not really discussed and explored and encouraged. It's almost one of these things where it's made fun of, and they're like, that label of they crazy and he crazy and stuff like that. It hurts. It discourages people from getting the help that they need. But I had a family who knew that I needed to decompress in order to press forward. And so it was them. I owe it all to them. And that's why when you read the book, the first page is dedicated to my aunts and my mom, and it was for their strength. And I tell them all the time, my mom gave me life, but they kept me breathing with the encouragements each and every week from them. So when I came home, I got the mental health care that I needed. And I needed it because I needed to understand that this situation should be a comma in my life and not a period.
Yeah.
So that's what I did. I accepted it. It was tough, but I accepted the help that I needed.
Yeah. And I think that the things that, you know, we as folks who are working on reentry, just folks in the community realize is that everybody isn't that lucky. You had an incredible support system that you talk about over and over and over in the book. Yeah. And just like you talked about, it is clear that those folks helped you get to where you needed to. There needed to be something inside of you, right, to get you to the point where you are now, where you went from where you were, that accusation, that false accusation, to somebody who's helping people, first as an investigator, now as an attorney, get their life back on order. So that obviously was something great about you, but there was obviously something great about your family. But what happens to those individuals, right, that don't have that support, right? The average person, I would submit, based upon my experience and my
They don't have it. Yeah.
Don't have that support.
You're right.
So if they don't have what you have, what happens? Is that why we see so much failure?
Yeah, here's what happens, Sharone. Look, what happens is what we see and what the numbers are telling us. Over 50% of the people who are released from incarceration, they are back within the prison system within 2 to 3 years. So when I say that to you, it should be shocking and it should be scary. But let me use another analogy to try to reach people. Could you imagine if there was a car company? Imagine if this car company, on average, when cars came off of its factory line, over 50% of those cars came back within 2 to 3 years because something was wrong with them.
We wouldn't allow it.
We would have a national debate on Congress about how to fix that car company or how to shut it down. So explain to me why we're not having a national conversation about how to fix this criminal system or shut it down.
Well, unfortunately, those conversations haven't been loud enough, but we have had organizations on the front lines that are trying to make it happen, that are trying to take these stories and turn it into progress and turn it into results. So with that said, I want to bring back in Jennifer.
That was an hour?
Bring back in Jennifer to talk a little bit about how we can take these stories and these narratives and really loop them back into discussion about goals and how we achieve these goals. So Jennifer, take it away.
Yeah. First of all, thank you guys. And Jarrett, I feel the exact same way. How has it gone that fast? This was phenomenal. My neck hurts because I've been nodding my head vigorously, the entire time. And Jarrett, I also have to tell you, I am going to use that about the car industry. That is such a great analogy, right? We wouldn't accept that. How is it that we view human beings as that disposable, that we're okay, with the results we're getting? Unbelievable. I want to turn to something specific you said that really touched me, and it was something that touched me in the book as well. There were times in the book where you talked about how difficult it was sometimes for you to call your mom or for her to come visit because of the pain she felt and how responsible you felt about that pain. And this is, and here you were wrongly convicted. And it made me think of so many of the men and women I see in Illinois prisons. I don't know why they're there. I don't know, who's rightly or wrongly convicted.
Right.
And that doesn't matter for our work. But I do think about that, when you talked also about how you didn't know how much you'd lost until you came home, but that she was experiencing that every day, knowing where you were. And I would just love to explore that a little bit, because I think that's the way you have framed it and talked about it. To me, brings out a human element that I hope will resonate with more people, so that they will really get in touch with what this does to a family.
Yeah. Jennifer, as I, these conversations, I'm working, so much. And, I wrote the book, and having these conversations jog me back and take me back to that place, to those different places and times and stuff like that. And so, in answering your question about the impacts and about, reintegration, and about how there's really no effort really placed in it. Could you imagine if we spent half of the resources we did on policing, on locking people up, to repairing people, right? We would have different results. If it's called corrections, why does it seem more like warehousing? And that's the thing. Like, I just, like, our job should be to stop believing that people are born at the scene of their accusation or their crimes. And we should be trying to move as quickly as we can in terms of, we should be moving with the same speed that we move to plead someone out, with the same speed to repair someone and get them back into their community, into their family, because it's creating a cycle. It's creating a cycle, and its effects are devastating. And I'll share one small story that won't take a bunch of time, and it goes to what me and Sharone was talking about, the impact. So I'm at a prison, and there are 3 individuals there who are all family members. And they were being visited by women who were bringing toddlers. And these kids who were coming through the metal detector, they were holding Barbie dolls, and they were literally stretching out their arms to be wanded, like through a metal detector. And no one asked this little girl when she was doing it. And it was like a joke, and they were laughing, and she was smiling, and they were giggling. I don't think people understand just how desensitizing that is to a kid going to visit someone there in the prison, and how it makes it seem as if going to prison is something just natural. It should never be natural and accepted that someone going to prison is a norm. There's something wrong with that.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I also wanted to bring forward something you mentioned earlier in the conversation that, for me resonates very differently now. I'm a mother. And when I started doing this work, I had little kids, and now I have teenagers.
Yeah.
And I remember quite well the first time that I went into a juvenile facility in my role at the John Howard Association, and met a 12-year-old who was in state custody. And, he was tall for his age, but had the face of a baby. And it just broke my heart. And as a mother of teenagers, I see how far from adulthood teenagers really are. So if people aren't sure about the brain science, spend some time with the teenager, and it will help you fully understand where they are developmentally. And when I think of you at 17, going down to a police station because the truth would protect you, because you didn't do anything wrong, and it wouldn't occur to you to ask for help. It just hurts my heart. And something we've been trying to do at the John Howard Association is we have an office of ombudsman. It's fairly new here in the state of Illinois, just over our juvenile system, so that there is an adult youth can go to while they are in state custody to report concerns or issues. And we've been trying to get them to expand the jurisdiction of the office to be in our juvenile detention facilities. Because in Illinois right now, we have many more kids in detention on a daily basis than we have in state custody, which speaks to the good work that's gone on in reforming the deep end of the juvenile justice system, and points out some of the work left to be done. Do you think having had someone like that available would have made a difference, that having an adult who wasn't part of the prosecution, wasn't part of the defense, was there simply as an advocate for young people in custody? Does that make a difference?
Absolutely. Look, it makes a huge difference. And that's without question, which is why we had to fight to get it done, right? It makes a huge difference. And what this should be about is not about trying to win. This should be about trying to get it right, trying to make sure that it's fair. And that's simply not going on. Because if it was about making sure that it was fair, I want to see a show of hands. How many times have you seen prosecuting bodies, whether that be Attorney General or the prosecutor's office, how many times have you seen them file suit or litigate on behalf of some of the atrocities that we're seeing in these neighborhoods, like the most expensive guns making it into the most impoverished areas, right? Well, like about the lack of childcare so mothers can go to work and make sure that their kids are safe. So these things all make up the reason why these communities are victims and really can't repair themselves. And so why should there be a question of Does a kid deserve a right to have a lawyer? What investigator would feel comfortable with interrogating a kid? It's another way to do this, Jennifer. Sharone, I thank you guys for this conversation, having the opportunity to be able to speak to it. But like right now, we need to have real litigation in these areas that continue to exist, because what I went through is still going on right now. We just got the law passed about not lying to juveniles. Why did it take so long, right? Why is it that we have to have these hotlines and things like that? Why is such trickery used when we simply should be trying to work together, all together, to get it right?
Yeah, I was really struck by something else you said when you talked about the men you met in the law library when you were tutoring.
Yeah.
And you said, some were innocent, some were not, but they'd been sort of railroaded into pleading out. And Sharone talked about the consequences, for not taking a plea deal, and that for many who don't understand the system they've been ensnared in, and may not be getting the best advice available, they're making these choices that impact their lives. And, you said, even if they did do it, are they guilty enough to be in prison? And I think that's such an important point. And there is so much work to be done there. I mean, we talk about, extreme sentences and mandatory minimums and all of the, horrible structures that have put in place that have led to mass incarceration and, just eaten away at the humanity of so many people inside our prisons. But I think the way you pose that question is really the question, we should be putting to policymakers and legislators and the public, right?
Yeah.
Because we know there are some people in prison that absolutely don't belong there because they didn't do it. There are other people that don't belong there because they have mental health issues, and this is the wrong place for them. And there are other people that don't belong there because, exactly to your point, they're just really not guilty enough to be there. They are not a threat to public safety. And there's got to be, another response that is more sensible and more humane.
We've allowed ourselves as a society to be feared into the repetitive cycle that isn't working. And that's this tough on crime, lock them up, throw away the key mentality. Have you ever seen someone run for office and say, vote for me? Because if I see wrongdoing, no matter what, by police or by anyone, I'm going to make sure it's right. Vote for me, because I'm going through all the cases of John Burge accusations and giving it a real look at to try to correct it. You don't see that, because that has not been the norm. And until it becomes the norm in our society that the justice system should be fair and equal and not just out to get a result, we'll keep being on this treadmill. And the only way we do that is if we shift the balance of litigation. We are going to have to start to sue on behalf of these communities of color who continue to see their babies being left on the streets dead, or being given all of these sentences of years and then come back as old men and in the same cycle again.
I think it's a great point. And I'll just jump in with this, that, one of the things that I think we need to think about is that, this is systematic. And, as a Cook County public defender, I can certainly say that our office hasn't always gotten it right. And part of that is because there's really a duality here, right? There is not just that, attorneys have not given good advice, but that the system has put us in a position, right, where it's worth it to advocate to somebody, don't roll the dice. Yeah. You will not get a jury of your peers. So taking this offer is the best option for you. And I think we have to really think about the intentionality of the system and how sometimes we look at issues as defects when they're really actually features of the legal system. So funding, public defenders obviously is an important issue to me. Of course, I would say that, but also thinking about the structures that put us in the place where, we are advocating for solutions that are far from just.
I mean, I just, Jennifer, if I could say this as a closing. I talked about growing up in the 80s and those drug laws. You know, we saw a war on drugs that completely decimated the familial structure in most of these impoverished areas, these Black communities. We saw that war on drugs tear up the school system, the family setting, and we saw a bunch of resources dumped into it. And its results has been mass incarceration. I want to see a war raged on the lack of resources, the lack of childcare, the lack of public defense funding, all the way across the board. And then you check back in with me 20 years later and let me know if we've seen mass people employed, mass communities of color doing better. We could, but we've been asking for years. It's time to start litigating.
No, Jarrett, I couldn't agree more. I mean, that's a battle I'm willing to join you in, you know, and to show up at. That's where the fight is now. And too many have been hurt for too long.
Indeed.
So it looks like we are actually up at time now, and I want to first thank our guests, Jarrett Adams and Sharone Mitchell, so much for this amazing conversation this evening. You know, I thought it was going to be great to have the two of you together. I didn't know it was going to be awesome and amazing and so thought-provoking and compelling. I had a good sense, but this was just a fabulous evening. And I can't thank you guys enough for being part of this event, for talking about your work, for talking about your experiences, and really, you know, helping people understand all the work that needs to be done to get us to a place, you know, where we have a system that's fair and just and equitable. And as much as there is so much work to be done, I want to thank you guys for all that you've done so far in advancing the cause, advancing the work, advancing the mission. I am so proud to be in the ranks of people fighting the good fight with you. So know that the John Howard Association is here, that we value you. We're so grateful to the work you do. And Jarrett, so grateful to you for sharing your story and helping influence change that way. So I want to also thank our audience, for everyone who joined us this evening. I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your support of the John Howard Association. We will be sharing information out after the event so that things that you may have heard about, information about where to get Jarrett's book and the phone number Sharone mentioned at the top of the conversation will all be made available through John Howard. We'll make sure we get that information out to you as soon as we can. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Jarrett. Thank you, Sharone. Have a fantastic rest of the evening.
All right. Thank you all so much for the opportunity. I really do appreciate it.
Bye. Talk to you all again soon.